Hey, I see there's a few people in here. Can you please confirm, maybe through the chat function, that you can hear me and see my screen? So if you can hear me and you're on here, could somebody respond to the chat, my chat question, which was just, can you see me and hear me and see my screen? Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. I appreciate it. So we'll get started in just about a minute and a half here. We're going to give people a little slush fund to get on. Looks like there's 6 people on here. Thank you, Alex. Thanks, Julia. And thank you for your LinkedIn note. I appreciate that. I'll accept that shortly. Okay, so we'll start in about 1 minute. We're going to give people till 3:01. Okay. I'm also just going to do a quick test here on just toggling between areas of and screens. Awesome. Okay. Looks like everything's working well. Okay. So with 30 seconds to get started here. All right. So we're going to get started. I appreciate you coming out and joining and actually being on time. I find with these kinds of talks, if you come in halfway through, sometimes you won't get the profit you're looking for out of your time investment. So thanks for being here on time. You'll be better equipped than maybe the stragglers who pop in a little late to grab a moment today. So for those of you who didn't check out the bio, I'm from Sandler. I own a Sandler organization here in Toronto, in Canada. Simply put, I guess I've owned and run this business for about 10 years. I started it from $0. So if we've got some sellers and sales leaders on the call here today, here's the bare bones basics of what you need to know about me. Everything you face when you're out there trying to build your business, build your patch, build your territory, from prospecting to selling to closing to client management, I face all of it. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how to make the sales game a little easier today, and for that matter, for those of you who have an interest to do a little bit more than maybe what you're doing now. And the gift of sales, of course, is oftentimes where we do more as business leaders, managers, or sellers. When we do more, we get to achieve our goals a little quicker than maybe the average out there in the population, in the workforce. Okay, because many of us can make a few extra dollars in income. Okay, so can everyone still hear me okay? I'm saying Julia, saying I can't. Okay, I'm going to assume you can all hear me. Okay, awesome. All right, so So really, we're going to talk about growing business a little bit. Okay, so we're going to go through a few slides. I might switch over to the whiteboard if it makes sense based on just where the dialogue go. But in the next 28 minutes or so, here's what we'll do. We'll talk about 3 ways to make sales a little easier and to do a little more. We're going to talk a little bit about problems we hear about from junior sales professionals, sales leaders, for that matter, senior sales professionals. Talk a little bit about why these problems happen, share a couple of actionable ideas, and then where you're willing and you have the guts to do it. If you've had a takeaway today, at the end of this thing, we can maybe share our takeaway. Okay, we can steal from each other a little bit and maybe garner up the profit of your 28-minute investment. The other thing, for those of you who don't know me, yes, you have a choice to stay in touch at the end. So if it's a no, that's no problem. Now, on the other hand, if you decide to stay in touch with through some way, shape, or form, I'll have a few options for you. And they're all very low pressure, by the way. I just want you to know that, okay? So yeah, all we're looking for is one takeaway to take the pressure off. So here's really the simple way, as far as I'm concerned, and this is going to seem pretty like commonsensical almost, to go out and grow your sales and make it easier. There is one way which most people I speak with don't want to go after, which is just working twice as hard. Okay, so there's kind of like a big no next to that. That is a way, though. If you think of doubling your business, you could double your business by just working twice as hard. You just might get tired, and at some point in your sales growth, when like you're heading towards that pinnacle, there's going to be a moment where you just can't do anymore. You're going to have to make it easier. The second way, though, to make it easier and to do more would maybe be to work bigger deals or increase price. Okay. Speaking of price discounting or price increases, one thing I want to do for the next 26 minutes is just, let's set COVID aside. I'm not saying we shouldn't have our ears on and our eyes open, but at this juncture, I think a lot of people are using COVID to externalize their success issues. Okay. Like this normalized world, or like word, pardon me, when's it really going to happen? I'm not sure. So, I guess what we need to do as sales professionals is take control of the situation. Okay. Then, thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. So take control of the situation and go out and still have your best year in 2020. The third thing that we could do to make sales a little easier is just consider sales ratios. Okay. So examples of sales ratios or sales data could be, how long your sales cycle is. Maybe it's too long, and if you could cut it in half, well, I guess you would save half the time and have the option of maybe closing twice as much while spending the same amount of time. Makes sense? Versus, some of those cycles that you might have in your pipeline right now that just seem to be dragging and dragging and dragging. The ones in your CRM where you keep putting the date further and further out, and you've got that hope, right? Okay, that it will close, but it doesn't seem, you seem to be the only one putting time and effort into it. The buyer doesn't seem to be. The other ratio I think about is really just the presentation or bid or demo or quote to close ratio. And what does that look like? Okay. In fact, Mark ran a quick poll on what's your biggest problem in sales right now, and it seems like the biggest problem based on the poll, which just happened a few minutes ago, was closing sales. Closing sales, which usually means we've worked hard, we've put time and effort in, but as the seller, we didn't get some goodness back, like a commitment or a check, let alone a commission. Okay, so those would be the 3 ways. Now, again, fundamentally, simple stuff, right? Like you're probably thinking, like, I want to leave this talk. There's not much here for me. But the problem with those fundamentals is we still hear and see things like the following. Sellers who are chasing buyers, following up. Okay, it's known as following up. Some of you even have that follow-up in your sales process, right? Like after I present, if it doesn't close, I should follow up. And that's usually a chase. It's actually a mental chase where the seller is thinking more about the buyer than the buyer is thinking about the seller. Okay, very inequitable, very unfair actually, The good news is sellers have rights, okay? And the other good news is sellers, they're mostly adults, right? I would bet that everybody on the call here is over 18. So you have rights. And you don't need to, I don't think because you're the seller, you have to put more energy into the buying process than the buyer. Problem is we see it all the time. Okay. Second problem we see is sellers, wasting time on sharing pricing, demoing, creating a solution, putting together thick bid documents, and probably putting a whole bunch of guesswork into it. Like, should I bundle that? How should we price that? That's a problem that's going to have a major impact on your closing ratio. Reason, it's quite simple. You probably have at best a 50-50 chance of guessing right. By the way, that could be your moment. If you've worked on some proposals or some bids or some pricing, even in the last week, and you found yourself guessing, just stop that. That's crazy. That's you hoping they'll like what you send. And the problem with that is oftentimes they won't. Or where pricing is concerned, certainly, we price too low and we should have actually got more profit on that transaction. The other problem we see is sellers dealing with stalls and objections. Like those late game stalls and objections after you've presented something. You ever dealt with those? They've almost become the norm in the sales profession. Accepted. My view is they're unacceptable. Here's why. Stalls and objections, you know what they are. They're little disguised items in your sales cycle that are actually deficiencies in your qualifying process, or if you prefer, in your needs analysis, right? They're things that came up after the fact that should have been discussed way before you ever presented something to a client or a prospect. It's a problem. And again, it creates energy and time, which makes sales harder. And there's even books written on overcoming objections. It sounds hard to me. I'd rather you not go through that. Some sellers worry about price. Even actually in this environment, like I said, have you discounted lately? Because of COVID, have you decided you're worth less than what you were before you started? Like 120 days ago, this process we've all been going through? I would bet you're worth just the same, maybe even more. But for some reason, price is always an issue. Not always, but more often than we'd like. It makes it harder for us to grow our sales. And the reality is if you end up in a price negotiation, here's just the responsibility we need to take. As the seller, you want to control the sale. If it comes down to price, please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying we're bad sellers, but you led the buyer there. If the buyer just views you as a price, you led them there. And it's something we need to take responsibility for. Okay. Last thing is just the notion of working too hard in sales, like the notion of having to convince a buyer or persuade a buyer to buy from us. It's funny when I think about that notion, I almost think about like the buyer, if you can visualize this, being up here, right? And then, the seller kind of being down here, and, it's kind of like the buyer is the parent and the seller is the child, and the child has to jump through a bunch of hoops to convince the parent that they deserve the candy. Maybe you felt that way sometime in sales. It actually, by the way, first 15 years of my career, that's how I felt a lot. And I actually wanted to get out of the profession. So I think to make sales easier, you don't want to ever be put in that situation. The other situation we sometimes see sellers put themselves in, especially if they're like experienced and they had a good track record, is they're actually the parent in the buyer-seller relationship. They're the parent. They're up here, and then the child is the buyer who maybe is in a tough spot, right? And we see the seller almost power play on the child, like the hard sell, like let me tell you why you need to change and why you should use me and why what you're using right now just doesn't make sense. I mean, you're in the spot you're in after all, and they become the teller seller. And that usually doesn't bode well for closing ratios either. I want you to think of it this way as an analogy: a parent telling a child that it's good for them to go to bed. And I mean, you've been a child, I've been a child, and maybe some of you are parents and you've told a kid to go to bed. You know what they do, right? They resist. And what it leads to is, yeah, maybe mom or dad, I'll go to bed, or hey, yeah, maybe mom or dad, I'll change to you, okay? But then they don't. Then they don't, okay? So what we're really looking for to kind of get out of some of these issues that we see is to create more of an adult to adult interaction. Again, you're all 18, right? And your buyers are probably 18 in most cases. So, you know, the adult to adult interaction is more just, hey, how do we figure this out? And, you know, what should we do next, if anything? And again, I think it sounds simple, but the issue is a few things get in the way of it being simple, okay? And it's usually how we interact with the buyer. In fact, you know, the stalls or problems or issues we just talked about, they are a result of how we as sellers have interacted with the buyer. There are no bad prospects. There are only poor salespeople. I know that's hard to take. The good news, though, is there's lots of poor salespeople out there who want to get better, and they'll do what it takes. There's also some poor salespeople out there who are just okay with mediocrity. They're not for us. And that's okay. It's not that they're bad people. They're just okay with where they're at. You're here, though, to elevate, right? Okay. So we have to take responsibility. Okay. And I think, you know, the first thing we can take responsibility on is, have you ever been on the buyer process? So, you know, you've been out and selling, or you've observed your team out and selling, and maybe you've seen them get led by the buyer versus lead the sale. Okay. The buyer process looks something that like is in front of you. It's not perfect nomenclature by any means, but you can decide if you've ever been on this system before. Like so the typical buyer system would look something like where the buyer shows a bit of interest. They're curious. You know, think of even your own buying tendencies. You know, maybe you wanted to learn about something or do some research and gather some information, and then, you know, when you did, there was something there, so you started to act motivated, or sometimes, depending on your what's the word I'm looking for? Your willingness to listen to a seller. Maybe you even got annoyed. Okay, the motivated buyer would like give a seller buying signals, give them like a feeling of security. Okay, the annoyed buyer would when they speak to the seller, maybe even treat them like that second-class person and just say, hey, listen, I don't have time for this. Like, enough with the questions. Like, just lay it on me. How are you going to help me? Okay. And whether they act motivated or annoyed, what they're trying to do is obtain information from the seller. Things like price, know-how, expertise, testimonials, reference points, case studies, etc. You name it. They want the seller's information because it has value. Okay. And they have a real knack for getting the seller to give it away. Again, they either give the seller an emotional feeling of security or an emotional feeling of fear. I might lose this if I don't stop asking questions and continue the needs analysis or discovery process. So if you didn't get that, buyers make sellers emotional. By the way, sellers, when they have a dry pipeline, they can get really emotional. They're very tied to the outcome. And it's easy to get them into what we call free consulting, where you're giving away your information without getting anything back. Their leverage, price and commitment. The seller's leverage, expertise, know-how, pricing, etc. Okay, and by the way, I think I just said price was a leverage point for the buyer. What I mean is money, like payment. Okay, so they get our information and they usually say that they like it, and then they often make a loose commitment. It could sound something like, hey, listen, Chris, I really appreciate you sharing the pricing and the solution. I like what I heard. And by the way, I don't see why we wouldn't proceed with you. But let me take what you've told me about today. I want to bring it back to a couple other decision makers in our business. I'll sit down with them before the end of the week, and then give me a call next Tuesday, say 9 a.m., and we can just take next steps, right? And it sounds nice, and it sounds like they're making a commitment, and maybe we even get excited. Like in our CRM, we put that to 90% closed, but then the problem is when we call next Tuesday, It sounds something like this. And by the way, we're in voicemail. Hey, Joe, it's Chris. You told me to give you a call Tuesday, 9 a.m. Here I am. We're going to take some next steps. Give me a call back, 555-5555. And then over the course of the week, maybe you leave, 3, maybe up to 4 voicemails. Because when you get there, you start feeling a little bit like you're begging, and you need them more than they need you. Or maybe you're being a bit like a pest, and it's not a good spot to be, okay? In fact, there's the last step of the buyer's process is oftentimes they'll disappear on us. Now, what I want you to consider, though, is where do they disappear? Where they typically disappear or begin the disappearing act or the non-commitment act or the non-motivated act is after you've given them the information, after you've given away your leverage. And they've given you nothing, really, just kind of a wishy-washy, loose commitment that sometimes, I'm not saying every time, because you've closed some of those, but sometimes they don't follow through on. And those are the ones we wish we could have back because we put the time and effort in, and it was a hot one, And it makes sales tough. I mean, with them, we probably never should have presented in the first place. They actually didn't deserve our information. So, if you think of the moment, that green circle, when you give your information away, oftentimes leading up to that, they're answering your emails. They're calling you. They're returning texts. But then after you've given it and they think they have what they need from you, they kind of ghost you sometimes. And it makes sales difficult, okay? And it's also the notion of, I hear like qualify people, but I don't see sellers disqualify people enough. Okay, so there's a couple of reasons we might end up on that buyer process more often than we like. The first is we just don't have a sales process. Some of you may be thinking, oh, I have a sales process, but I challenge you. Is it up here? Is it up here? Or is it actually documented? And if it's documented, is it followed? The process is there to keep you emotionally in control so that fear or anxiety or feeling of security that sometimes we get in the sales calls, we don't go through it. We can just stick to the plan, okay? And we're less likely to give away that leverage that slows down the sales cycle immensely from our research, okay? So it could be that we just don't have a sales process. The other thing is it could be that you actually have a process, but the more traditional selling process, believe it or not, plays right into the buying process I just showed you. So I'm going to step back just to kind of walk you through this slide a little bit. But like at first they express interest, and that's great. It's like a little gift. Think of, we don't have to prospect today, and they're showing a bit of interest in us. The buyer showing interest in the seller, and the seller's job is to get a meeting and do a bit of a needs analysis, but they act motivated and they start giving us that false sense of security perhaps, or maybe they get annoyed with us and they just say, Chris, listen, cut to the chase. I've only got 20 minutes here. Tell me how you're going to help me. I'm a busy decision maker, so we better do it. They put us into presentation proposal mode, which feels great, by the way. Like it's when we're talking and kind of blowing and going, like it feels good sometimes, right? Those are sometimes the meetings where you leave and you're like, I was on, and then you don't close it. The reason you didn't close is because they got your information, you tried to close, they gave you a wishy-washy commitment. Maybe they actually answered the call on Tuesday. They said, hey, can you sharpen your pencil a little bit? We handle the objection. But then they still disappear on us, and then we're left in chase mode. Okay, so what I'd suggest as well is if that sales process, needs analysis, present proposal, close, handle objections, and follow up, maybe close again before you follow up, looks familiar, it could be that you're just playing into the buyer process and you're kind of jumping through the hoops, okay? So the question is who is leading the dance? Is it the buyer or the seller? And who should have control? Well, I mean, it's pretty simple. We should have control. We're doctors of our own industry, right? You're a doctor of your industry. I'm a doctor of my industry. Have you ever walked into a doctor's office and said, hey, doctor, I've got a scratch here on my arm. I want surgery. I want it tomorrow. it's going to cost me $500. And then after surgery, you're going to give me this prescription to dull the pain. Let's go. So like, buyers don't really have the right to self-diagnose. Patients don't have the right to self-diagnose. So your job is going to be very good at that diagnosis. By the way, if you think you have a closing problem, typically what our research would show is you actually don't have a closing problem. You have a diagnosis problem. You present too early. You prematurely present. You prescribe to sales malpractice. Not you, but just the poor sellers we see. Meaning they rush to presentation because they think presenting is one step closer to close. It's actually just one step closer to trying to convince or persuade them and then running into resistance. Okay, so it's not the close, it's actually the qualification process that truly is the close from what we can tell. Okay, now if the buyer is in control, I guess you still can grow your business, but you're probably going to have to go with working twice as hard because your cycles will still be as long as they are. Your close ratios won't change. Maybe they'll even get worse. I don't know, but we want to work on what's easier, right? Which is getting more for what we're worth because you're worth more than what you charge, working on larger deals perhaps, and then condensing how long we spend on deals. Okay, so the one rule I want you to walk away with, there's a ton of Sandler rules, but the one rule I want you to give you is just no free consulting. Prospects, buyers must prove to you that they deserve your proposal, that they deserve your demo. Not just because they issued an RFP, not just because they said they'd love a demo. That's not qualified. They don't deserve that. There's got to be a real reason for you to spend that 60 minutes, or for that matter, a resource in your company to spend the 2 or 3 hours it takes to put together the pricing. Now, some people say, hey, it's really easy for us to quote. It takes us literally 5 minutes. Okay, that's fine. But that 5 minutes, if the stack of quotes is this big that didn't close, at the end of the year, and the stack of quotes that did close is about this big, and you add up all the minutes, you're probably not much different than the person who works on 10 gigantic RFPs every year and spends like multiple weeks putting them together and not closing them. Okay, so just consider that. So here's a few Sandler philosophies. Okay, first is you got to have a documented sales process. By the way, if you want this document, you can email me. Okay, it's ckelly@sandler.com. There's no strings attached. But really, when you think of sales process, that blue section there, if you can't quite read it, really should be the steps of your process. Now, Sandler clients, platinum Sandler clients, they don't all have the same steps. Really, what Sandler is a fuel to the steps. So the steps where there's a mutual investment of time and effort between buyer and seller would be the blue area. The green area is what the buyer must give the seller in each step to prove to them that they deserve another time investment from the seller. And then the gold area are what we call the pivotal points. So what kind of tools, what kind of talk tracks, what kind of octane, if you would, do you bring, and what level of octane do you bring to each step so that you're able to get the information you need from the prospect or buyer and get the truth versus perhaps mistruths, partial truths, or if you prefer lies, which can happen sometimes. And let me just ask you, have you ever lied to a salesperson? You might have. And if you did, you got to ask yourself why. And if that why resembles anything you do in your selling cycle, you should probably stop and do something a little different. Okay. So the second philosophy I'll give you is just the notion of being disarmingly honest. I just talked about truth and being lied to. If we want truth from our buyers, we must be willing to share the truth. Okay. Being disarmingly honest would probably sound something like this. Hey, Chris, listen, I heard a whole bunch about Sandler and who you guys have helped. Like, we've actually used another training organization. It just doesn't seem to be working, or we're seriously considering a move. Why should we change over to you from your perspective? Like, what are the reasons? Well, Bill, one, I appreciate you sharing that. And, sorry to hear about some of the issues. Now, here's the thing, though. We should probably back up. I'm not sure I can help you. First, you'd have to explain what's going on with the other organization. And by the way, if I don't think I can help with those issues, I will tell you straight up, we can just stop. Now, on the other hand, if I do think we can help you, we're probably not coming up with a solution today. So I'd suggest we get our calendars out, maybe set up 60 minutes. Okay, does that sound fair? So, what's disarmingly honest about that and what is more credible is I don't say, hey, well, our service and our track record and our experience and our 50 years in business and all of our global businesses across the world, we're in 70, I don't say that. Instead, I actually say, I'm not sure I can help you, which, by the way, is very adult to adult. Okay. The second thing is this: stop using features and benefits. Stop leading with them. Take them off your website. They're all about you. I mean, you've read books, you've heard podcasts that buyers want their problems solved. They want you to know about their problems. So instead, if you want to have a good doctor-patient conversation, have a sense of what their problems might be and start with that, because that's what they want to talk about. They don't really care about your track record, your price. They don't care about how good you are or the testimonials or the case studies. What they care about is an adult to adult conversation where they get to share their issues with you. And by the way, if they don't have the issues that you can solve, you'll just tell them up front. Okay. So those are a couple of Sandler thoughts. And by the way, these thoughts, whether we're in a tough macro environment or a pandemic environment or not, they still apply. I think, though, these days, how good you are as a salesperson has been elevated. You must be a way better salesperson than the average one. People are a little more time compressed right now. We have to sell through this technology sometimes too. We're not always face to face with people. So you got to follow a system and you got to be really good at it. Think of the best in their professions, musicians, athletes. They do the drills more than they play the game. Here's the problem with sales. We practice too often during the game. Okay, by the way, our clients, what they do is they practice a ton, way more than they play the game. So when they're playing the game, they don't feel the pressures of the match because their muscles are in the right spot to perform at that highest level that they deserve to perform at. All right, so here's what we can do. Let's use the chat. What's your main takeaway from today? Just one takeaway. And to get this rolling, we usually need one brave volunteer. So if that's you, if you could, what's your takeaway from today? And then maybe we can get a couple more on the board and steal from each other a little bit. Okay, so I'm not seeing any takeaways come up, no problem. So the next thing for you is, do you want to stay in touch? Okay, no's fine. Here's what yes means. If you want to talk to me, you got to email me. If you want some free content, you'll email Sue Hawkins. She's our office and marketing manager. If you ever want to come check out a session, a gym session, and work out with us, we do those Tuesdays, 10:30 to 12:30. You can email Sue. And then last but not least, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Okay, so we'll leave you to it. Good prospecting, good selling, and have a good balance of 2020.